everyone. I'm Terry Schindler from Polyplexus and the host of today's episode of Talk Polymath. In this episode, we're speaking with Colin Strong, the Global Head of Behavioral Science at Ipsos and professor at Nottingham University Business School. Much of his work focuses on the activation and application of behavioral science in the real world. For those of you joining us for the first time, Polyplexus is a platform dedicated to accelerating the interdisciplinary research process. You can join the community at polyplexus.com. Colin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I want to just start because there's a lot going on in our world, from pandemics to global climate change, to disinformation and conspiracy theories, to war. You have written about it as a polycrisis environment. How can behavioral science help us understand ourselves and how we're processing and reacting in this environment?
Well, we need something, don't we? And I thoroughly agree with your analysis. It feels as if we're at a time where this historian Lorraine Dalston, who I like, I often quote her phrase of ground zero empiricism. You know, it's as if we're having to work everything out from scratch and try to make sense of this time which we're in, which is pretty hard work to do so. So it feels as if we need some form of discipline that helps us to navigate this. And behavioral science feels like a useful lens for us to apply because, you know, fundamentally, we're in an environment where we need to understand how to behave and what to do and how to manage this highly liquid, changing environment which we're in. And it feels as if behavioral science isn't necessarily a discipline which has all the answers, for sure, but it's a really good starting point in my mind as it's a means of bringing together, in my thinking, a range of disciplines around the social sciences to help us understand ourselves and each other, our groups we're in, communities, and cultures in which we live in, and that feels important and it feels useful.
And so as we think about all these issues, is there a common thread from a behavioral science perspective, or does each issue, you know, which range really in level of severity and I don't know, the different areas it attacks in your brain, does each of these bring its own specific context?
I suppose one of the reasons why I sort of explore quite a range of things and work with others to explore and write and publish and so on, and in my applied work as well. It's really to try and answer that very question. You know, it's just can we pull out some overarching themes which seem to operate across these different areas and give us a bit of a broader understanding of what's happening. And in a way, I think there's a I can't remember who said it, but you know, you can understand things when they go wrong. When they're all working, you can't quite see what's happening because, you know, we take it all as read and all as given, you know, but it's when things aren't going well, it's when the wheels are falling off, then we can then start to understand what's happening. And I feel like some of the themes which seem to kind of pull out a little bit. One, it's clearer now about the degree to which we, as humans, are more connected and related than perhaps narratives of the last few decades would have us believe. You know, we've been operating to quite a, well, to say the least, quite an individualistic perspective and understanding of human behaviour. And we're starting to see a lot more clearly with COVID, for, you know, if nothing else, just the degree to which we're all massively interconnected and reliant upon each other in ways which can be hard to see when everything's kind of working well. I think also another theme which I feel often comes out is just the degree to which actually people are pretty resourceful and pretty smart and pretty capable, and actually seek to make sense of the world, and that's quite a different narrative to some of the ways in which we have often talked about ourselves and thought about ourselves. So I think in a way there's almost a sort of rethinking, regrouping, re-examining of who we are in relation to each other and the degree to which that shapes us. And those sorts of themes and from that kind of core premise, I think a lot springs from that. And there's, in many ways, of course, it's not hardly the first person to come up with that idea. There's plenty of people will have thought that. But I think we're seeing the way in which that is expressing itself is, and the way in which we're all able to see it in front of our eyes much more clearly, is something that's changed and has allowed us to sort of rethink who we are and what we're about.
And it's an interesting idea of the collective connectedness, right? When we also think about the technology platforms that we're also all using, right? So you cite work by Neil Levy when you write about polycrisis. And I just love this line that he had written: as humans, we live in a cumulative culture in which our collective shared knowledge has a type of ratchet effect, with our collective knowledge becoming a shared platform on which others can build. And that's really a fascinating metaphor in a world full of literal shared tech platforms, that we have this shared platform that isn't actually tangible. It's something we're building together, but it's very intangible. And it really seems to directly relate to some of our current struggles with misinformation and disinformation and that spread. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? How can we understand misinformation, disinformation? What's it in relation to technology platforms? I think it's probably too easy to point the finger at technology as the source of misinformation, disinformation, and look, after all, this is nothing new. These are issues which we've had forever. You see, there's accounts from Roman times of conspiracy theories and disinformation and so on and so forth throughout history. We weren't dependent upon technology platforms as we know them now back then. So I don't really think we can say that actually technology platforms have fundamentally changed this in a way which seems to be the popular narrative at times. I for sure I think that technology platforms allow people of minority perspectives to find other people with those minority perspectives and for voices to be louder, but you've got to be. I think we've got to be a bit careful about sort of overemphasizing the potency of these, but also we need to just look at the motives of, well, why are people then perhaps posting some of this stuff online? And I think that and again, this is something where we start to see something interesting about people, is that actually it's easy for us to just think, well, because someone's posting something which might seem pretty odd or pretty extreme or whatever, actually they don't necessarily believe it. Sometimes what people are doing is posting because it's kind of a bit wacky, or actually, well, maybe this is an interesting question, or it's a legitimate question, or it's not necessarily we got to be careful not to think about belief in this binary way of I believe it or I don't believe it. Well, actually, there's quite a lot of sort of grayness between those different sorts of ends of the spectrum, and I suppose it's things like this which then, if we can dig into this and seek to understand it, that tells us something really interesting about ourselves, about the nature of beliefs, but also about why have we moved to the situation where, we're assuming that misinformation is the result of technology platforms, and that if people are posting on something on there, then they believe it. Where's that notion come from? And so in a sense, these kind of questions allow us to kind of, in a kind of fairly sort of interesting way, to start unpacking, well, why have we come to that conclusion? And perhaps these other possibilities are also true. Yeah, there's a Cory Doctorow writes really well on this stuff about technology platforms and the overemphasis of them in terms of their sort of powers of persuasion. And I think some of his sort of points are really cogent and make a lot of sense to me anyway. But yeah, I think there's a lot going on in this whole area of misinformation, but I don't think it's as straightforward as it always first seems, to my mind.
So yeah, because you're referencing some of your research on conspiracy theories that you've published. What else do we need to know about conspiracy theories? Because clearly there's a performative nature. There's an acceleration problem of, the speed of which things can travel around now. It's just a little bit easier to get something to go. And so what else came out of that study about conspiracy theories?
I think it's kind of interesting is the kind of weaponization of the term, isn't it? And so everything kind of gets a little bit sort of turned on its head, because the one way to marginalize someone's set of beliefs is to call it a conspiracy theory. And I don't know how helpful that is. Maybe actually if someone has some pretty minority beliefs, then perhaps what we need to be doing is to engaging and bringing them into a conversation, rather than othering them and putting them on, sort of like, well, actually, this is we can't countenance this perspective. And I think that's I think we can almost understand them through the sort of study of rhetoric and sort of linguistics, because if you there's just so much of the time the term is used in this kind of topsy-turvy way to politicians use it to dismiss other people's arguments and so on and so forth. So in a sense there is a question, well, what do we really mean by this anyway, and how useful is this as a term? Would be my take on it. And also we're doing some research ourselves, looking at what motivates people to put things online that might be considered conspiracy theories or misinformation, and a lot of it is I think really is about social engagement and getting reaction from others, and it's people aren't always, people's motivations aren't always what we assume they are, and we've got to be careful about jumping to conclusions. Would be my take on it.
So, right. And what about, I think, in a lot of ways, we're in a dance with the stories that we tell ourselves. So research on our capacities, for example, you read often in the popular press that we as humans are not designed to deal with climate change or larger systemic issues. And so what is the influence of behavioral science models on our cultural narratives and the stories we tell ourselves in today's media climate?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, about how beliefs form and why we hold the beliefs that we do, and what power do they have over us. There's people like, I think Kenneth Gergen, I think is his name, and he talks about the way in which psychology has sort of changed over time as a function of the overarching political ideologies which are sort of dominant at that point. And in a way, I've got some sympathy with that perspective. And so I think the perspective that has been quite dominant, and I think is possibly starting to ebb away, again, is this sort of highly individualistic perspective, but also with this perspective that we have some form of deficit, that we just can't do certain things, that we're irrational. We don't, we don't have the sort of capabilities that are needed. And I think that's a really there's obviously some degree of truth in that, but it does feel like a very narrow, rather sort of pessimistic view of humans, but also one which you can dismantle as well. This isn't necessarily true. There's alternative explanations which would say pretty much the opposite of that. There's a great paper by Jennifer Jackett on this very issue about sort of whether we're just too flawed to overcome climate change. And she did with her collaborators, really great job at dismantling this argument and putting forward the alternative, which is, we're absolutely able to do so. And the issues really are much more about sort of societal institutional barriers and fundamentally political challenges rather than individual challenges about individual psychology. And so I think this is where we just need to be careful as social scientists, sort of not to essentialize these wider political issues. They are political issues, not necessarily, or disentangle when they're political issues versus when they're issues to do with individual psychology and individual behaviors. And that those lines are grey and they're difficult. And this is really kind of difficult stuff to disentangle. But this is where the work of academics and practitioners can come together and just to sort of challenge ourselves on some of this and just have and look, we started off by talking about the nature of the times which we're in. We've got to be, we've got to be thinking in some pretty creative ways, and maybe sort of some thinking which might have seemed a bit radical, 5 years ago. Well, maybe we need to bring it onto the table and just start thinking a little bit more I don't know, in a bit more of a sort of exciting way about what's sitting underneath some of these conclusions that we've come to, and maybe we need to challenge them, because quite frankly, we've got a few problems. Some of the old ideas haven't always served us particularly well, and we need a bit of new thinking right now. So I think that's the place we're in, and that's the place we need to be.
And right, and these media stories, or these stories that we tell ourselves, can become self-fulfilling prophecy. So is there a reframing of behavioral science and its models currently underway, do you think?
I think in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, we've seen massive shifts. And I think that historically, behavioral science, as a kind of practitioner activity, which I see it predominantly as a means of applying social sciences to real world problems. So it's and I just the last 5 or 6 years, I think it's moved from being something which is really the very, very dominant view was very individual. That would be sort of shaped by pictures of icebergs with sort of 95% of our behavior is non-conscious, and pictures of Homer Simpson that we're all irrational and etc. And I think and look, that's perhaps that it had a service. There was a value to that, in that it was it ushered in an era where we were bringing social sciences into the sort of mainstream of decision making, of sort of deconstructing what's going on, of practitioner work, and that's a good thing. But for sure that's been on a bit of a journey, and I'd say that those kind of quite narrow models are now starting to be seen a bit more. What I should say is, I think, be seen a bit more in perspective, in context, that they are one tool which we've got of a number of different tools which we can use in order to understand behavior. So it's always tempting when there's a dominant model, isn't there, to sort of pick away at it and criticize it, because it's almost like it's an easy target, right? So but actually, my view is that it explains certain things really well, but it sort of overreaches in its explanatory value, and so therefore what we need to bring in is and what is happening are a whole range of other tools which you can use to look at human behavior. And I think what we're seeing is a kind of move to a situation where, in a very good practitioner way, we're putting the problem out there and then saying, right, what's the nature of that problem? What class of problem is it? And therefore, what sort of body of work can we use to sort of unpack that and understand that? And then, to the subject of your podcast, this is becoming much more multidisciplinary, and I think all good for that. We need that, absolutely need it.
About a year ago, and without putting you on the spot, you wrote about behavioral science themes for 2022. We're now in the latter half of 2022. And just to refresh your memory, and we're not going to evaluate them so much, but I want to ask you a couple questions. You talked about pandemic epiphanies, radical inclusion, disappointment in reality, the challenge of innovative imagination, the move from one to many, the idea of contested knowledge, denial and regret, and renewal through ritual. In your mind, and knowing that you are not a prognosticator, but which have borne out most strikingly this year? Have any of them surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the annual kind of crystal ball gazing, which you hope you're never going to be held account to, but
but here we are.
But here we are. So I'd say that I think one of the themes, rather depressingly, which has really been borne out, of disappointment in reality. There's a sort of period during COVID where, okay, once COVID is over, we will be able to do X, and COVID isn't over. And it's also that we're in a period where, for all the things we've talked about, and so I think there's a theme which we're just writing about at the moment, which is looking at this notion that your future self always has great possibilities, and you can feel very positive about it. And but what happens when that future self really collides with the reality, which many people have been in, but far more people are going to be in and are in terms of their ability to, I don't know, just earn a decent sort of, earn enough to sort of, keep themselves sort of in a fairly basic lifestyle, let alone a job which they find fulfilling, and in a career which they're able to develop, and I think that sort of the economy and the impact of that on people's sort of expectations and their view of themselves in the world, I think that's the kind of thing which has really dominated and come through. I think one of the other themes I'd say, which continues to sort of be fought out, is this whole issue of contested knowledge, and what do we mean by knowledge, whose knowledge, what's a fact, and so on. And and you can get quite philosophical about this, but in a way, this is huge, and it's playing out. And you look at the issues like sort of wellness influencers, to take one example, and the degree to which some, not all, but some, will very much contest the sort of medical model of well-being, and have a very different frame of reference, and that's absolutely sort of being fought out, and I think I would say that sort of misinformation conspiracy theories is in a way, it's a you could see it as a sort of front line for these sorts of battles of how we go about understanding the world, and who's got who's got sort of I don't know, primacy in terms of the explanations of the world. So I'd say those are kind of key things which I would say are being sort of borne out. I'd say the sort of thing which I'm seeing less of and is around sort of imagination, and I think that's a really interesting area to explore. And why is it that we don't imagine different worlds and quite so readily? And there can be huge amounts of explanations for that, of course. But in terms of sort of popular discourse, etc., and where that popular discourse is coming from. But I do think that's an area which is going to be which is interesting, and we could be thinking more about. And what is what's the role of imagination, and I'd say that it has a very powerful role in pulling us forward and helping us to sort of consider alternative ways of living. And crikey, we need that, don't we? So
I would, yeah, 100%. And I'm thinking a lot about sort of this idea of the shared platform and yet the contested knowledge. There are a lot of really yin yang forces pulling on us and our behaviors and our cognitive load, quite frankly. Do you see anything on the horizon for 2023 that is sort of coming out of some of the chaos of 2022?
I guess one of the themes which I think is kind of interesting is and sorry, this is a bit of depressing, but it's like we're staring down the sort of the barrels of a gun of climate change, and the news today was of the was it the UN reports, a couple of UN reports saying, well, look, we're not on. There's no way we're going to get anywhere near 1.5 degrees. We might as well just we've now got to move from sort of aiming at that to just accepting we need to fundamentally reorganize ourselves to cater for this sort of much sort of warmer world we're going to be in, and I think that I feel like we haven't really properly conceptualized what that means, and what not only means what it means for us, but what it means for future generations. And that understanding of what it means for future generations, how does that affect us? There's a great, really great book by Samuel Scheffler, I think his name is, on the what he calls the afterlife. And what he means by that is just what comes after us. He's not talking about it in any kind of religious way. It just means like, okay, when you die, what are the implications? Does it matter what happens after that? And he makes a really powerful case for saying, actually, you know what, it really does matter. And if we feel as if the world is fundamentally kind of coming to going to be in a much worse position, that's not good of course, it's not good for generations afterwards, but it's also not good for us right here, right now. It affects us in ways which we might not necessarily realize. And I feel like that's going to be something which is going to be a sort of a bit of a sort of year of reckoning for us, as some of those sorts of messages which have been around for a while, but actually now feel as if they're kind of getting to this kind of tipping point. I think that's another point I'd say. Sometimes we talk about tipping points, and it just feels as if we seem to be at one, and I feel like next year could be a tipping point where lots of things kind of come to fruition, so it's kind of in one sense it's kind of exciting, but it's to sort of maybe that's the wrong term actually. So maybe not. In some senses, it's daunting, I think is fair to say. But also at the same time, it's something which, again, provides us with a challenge. It provides us with a sort of means by which we can better understand, and we can start sort of rethinking about what being human involves, because things aren't working in the way which we expect them to. And so we can then start seeing more clearly the workings And in a way, it creates an opportunity for us to intervene, to rethink things. And this is always the theory of change, right? You know, you've got to kind of, you've got to kind of unfreeze. And you know, in that period of unfreezing, that allows something new to come in before you then sort of, you know, go back and sort of reset again, and you know, in a new formulation. And I think that's a kind of, almost like, rather than just thinking about that this is a sort of, you know, too depressing, you know, we can allow ourselves some degree of excitement and imagination to think, well, how could we reformulate these things in this moment at this point, rather than just allowing ourselves to be overly pessimistic and overcome with anxiety about it.
And doom, right?
Yeah.
And you've talked a little bit about ritualizing sustainability. Just quickly, can you tell us what that means? That seems to be related to this.
Kind of. I feel like so rituals are a really important aspect of anthropology, and this is where I think increasingly sort of psychology, anthropology are becoming closer together, is as our understanding about human behavior is sort of, you know, moving away from the individual as a unit of analysis to sort of wider groups of people, you know, however we want to sort of identify them. You know, it becomes useful to look at people in that way. And I think rituals is this kind of this funny thing whereby we have meaning which sits between us. You know, we always think as meaning it sort of sits in our head, but actually it kind of really sits between us an awful lot of the time. And you know, and I don't know, a kind of, you know, a UK example is a sort of traditional example is setting the sort of doing a sort of setting out the dinner table on a Sunday, you know, would be the kind of traditional ritual, which would mean, you know, it's not just the meaning of it. It's not just actually you're putting the sort of cutlery and crockery on the table. You're you know, there's a whole sort of host of meanings there about continuity and about family and friends and whatever it may be. You know, but there's a host of sort of meanings associated with those sorts of behaviours. And those create something really important and valuable that sort of brings people together in a very sort of strong and long-standing way. And perhaps I think some of the points around sustainability as well, maybe we could be using those in a way to perhaps sort of shape the way in which we're responding, you know, and create new rituals and new ways of doing things that perhaps you know, which perhaps, you know, individually these things might just seem a bit pointless. They're dropped in the ocean, but if we can see that we're part of this ritual which has greater meaning, and then it becomes something which we can understand ourselves as part of a collective, and it allows us to sort of make change happen more effectively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, 100%. Do you have a dream? So given our proximity to tipping points and maybe the failures to date of some of our imagination, do you have a dream collaborator or an ideal interdisciplinary project, like say with neuroscience or something, that you'd like to explore, that you think would be really timely?
I keep meaning to try and find historians to talk to, because I feel like there's so much we could learn about, well, what's gone on before. And I know I'm just talking to my mother about the 1970s, where it was sort of a time of high inflation and lots of industrial action, and really sort of it's you know, we're in this now, and you know, what happened then, and what was the sort of socio-cultural kind of psychology of that. So I feel we could do more of that. I feel like we could use the sort of explanatory devices that we've got from the social sciences and behavioral science and apply that to, well, what's been going on in the past. There's another great book which I've been reading about when there's periods in history where there's been significant shifts in the climate and sort of mini ice ages and so on, and the way in which that's been related to fundamental changes in society and the adoption of religious beliefs and I think understanding that might help us now and at the very least to create some hypotheses about, well, where might this be going. So I definitely think that's an area which would be hugely fruitful and interesting. I'm sure there's plenty of people doing that. But you know,
closer to the humanities, in other words, right? And sort of, I mean, history.
Yeah, I think, yeah, bring in the humanities. Yeah, and we kind of, I feel like we you know, let's not create these kind of artificial sort of barriers. And, you know, what we're looking for are new frameworks of understanding and reference, and they're not always in the obvious places. So let's bring them more closely together and try stuff out and see what works. But you know, and I don't know, there are interesting themes emerging. I mean, one of the things which I've been reading recently is also just a great book by someone called David Noble. It's an old book. It's about I think it's called The Religion of Technology, and about the way in which technology came from very strong religious beliefs, and the way in which through history up to, I think, when he was writing it in the sort of in the sort of I don't know, maybe in the sort of early sort of noughties or something, you know, the way in which that has shaped the way in which the how we approach technology and so on, and the way in which we sort of offer it a certain sort of reverence and in our lives, and I think those sorts of perspectives look really interesting to me, and I think they're useful if we can bring those into a wider conversation where we can start unpacking some of those things with the psychology of what's going on, and bringing the social sciences to that and using that as a framework of reference. And to me, those sorts of things seem, I feel, where we are at the moment, those are going to be helpful to have that kind of big thinking perspective applied to where we are now, and to start creating some hypotheses to help us understand where we might be going.
I could talk about this all day long. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And for listeners who might want to follow up, what's the easiest way to get in touch with you? I know you write a blog on Substack.
Yeah, on Substack or on LinkedIn, or just find me at on my Ipsos email as well. So and just you'll be able to find me if you just Google me. So but yeah, please do get in touch. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks so much. And to check out more cross-disciplinary conversations, follow us on the Polyplexus YouTube channel. Thanks, Colin. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Terry.